Welcome to watercolor painting tutorial of a realistic plum with leaves. Outline drawing is done, and I will leave you a link to different methods of transferring line drawing to your original painting paper with an elastic eraser, removing the excess amount of graphite off the paper. I will also protect with plain paper my painting. Plain paper is attached by tape on the upper edge of my painting paper. Placing paper towel under my arm so I can easily rest it and paint. Mixing watercolors. For this plum, I will be using Indian yellow together with permanent rose, a little bit more of permanent rose. Mix of these two gives warm peachy color. Separately clean permanent rose, also clean manganese violet, perylene violet together with sennelier red and permanent rose. A little touch of Indian yellow to make it more richer, warmer. Manganese violet with ultramarine blue, perylene violet. That will be for the shadow part of this plum fruit. Now to the painting stage. Be sure that your water is clean after mixing watercolors with the round synthetic brush. I'm applying water layer. Water layer is just enough for watercolors to be moved. It's not a water puddle on the paper surface. As you can see, I can lift paper and the moist layer stays in place. No water is dripping anywhere. That's how small or how big amount of water, decide on your own, but it shouldn't be floating around. Starting with manganese violet and permanent rose clean pigments, I'm placing the very light amount of watercolors for this first layer. It's super important to start slowly and very lightly. We need to get edge lines, outer edge lines of the plums very soft, because this is a round subject and it's not ending where the reference is ending. The plum is round and the body of the plum goes away from our eyesight. We don't see the continuing part of this plum, so we need to create, it is called disappearing edges, that something is going away. If we will have a crisp dark edge line, then we will lose this visual look that this plum is roundish, it's three-dimensional. We need to have soft edges, and to get the soft edges, I'm painting lightly, putting watercolors really gradually, slowly, with little brush strokes in little areas, using watercolors that we pre-mixed in the beginning, and with round synthetic brush smoothing the applied layers. And I also left approximately 2 millimeters of the outer edge, like a small gap. And now with round synthetic brush, I'm applying, pushing watercolors towards this outer edge. This gives me a room to create this soft edge. If I will instantly, when I just was applying watercolors, go straight to the very edge, to the very outer edge of this plum, then I will definitely get this crisp watercolor edge that is very commonly seen. But to get it soft, we need to push with round synthetic brush or any other round brush towards the edge. We are smoothing towards the edge. And also, water amount on the paper surface plays a major role here. If you will have a watery puddle, that there are a lot of water underneath watercolors, and when you will apply pigment, then after drying, pigment will go to the outer edge of that puddle and create this crisp edge. I'm still applying small amounts of watercolors that we pre-mixed. Looking at the reference, I have a reference opened right beside me. I'm constantly checking. I zoom in closer to see all the color tones. This plum has a lot of color tones. There are pinks, yellows, peachy colors, dark violet, perylene violet, mix of perylene violet. There are a lot of different color tones. And the more richer, the more pigments you will add to this plum, the richer it will look. If you will have a constant one color tone for the whole plum area, it will look more like an illustration, not as a realistic painting of a real plum. At the lower part, I'm applying a mix of perylene violet and permanent rose Indian yellow. Again, I'm layering with really transparent layers, slowly and gradually. This tutorial takes 2 hours and I'm painting quite fast, so maybe for you it can even take much longer period of time, and that is normal. Don't be afraid to spend extra time for your painting. Here's a closer look and side view of how I apply watercolors. And as you can see, the surface color is changing really slowly and gradually because I'm painting super transparently. And also, there's so many dry brush strokes, more dry brush strokes rather than watery brush strokes to create this soft and fluffy look of the plum. This plum is quite fluffy and matte. It's not glossy, it's not shiny. It also maybe depends on different varieties of plums, but this one isn't super shiny. And to get this texture, this look of a very soft and fluffy surface, I'm doing quite a lot of dry brush. And when I'm dry brushing, to get an even look, I'm using a side of my brush. As you can see here, again, I am applying watercolors and smoothing the applied layer, constantly smoothing watercolors that have been just applied. Slowly and accurately, I'm painting really light, using really light watercolor mixes. Don't rush here with dark watercolors. As you can see from the reference, there's still a long way to go to get to the real color. Now I want to show you my light area and light area on the reference. After first layer, your light area should be much wider than it appears in the reference, because with layering it will become smaller and smaller as it is in the reference. If we will leave it as it is in the reference after first layer, by the finishing part you will end up with no light area at all. This is really important thing to remember, to learn that leaving light much wider, bigger than it appears in the reference. Now with finer tip brush, taking watercolor mixes that we pre-mixed in the beginning, and as you can see from the corner of my palette, I use very small amount, like tiny. I diluted it with water, not with any other pigment or white pigment. I'm diluting it with water and using really small amount. Here is a closer view of my tiny and super light brush strokes. The surface color changed so softly and so gradually. As you can see, I don't have contrasty dark layers, contrasty dark spots when I apply new layer. Everything is going further super gradually and super slowly. This is the key for this plum painting, that you have patience to apply those many layers. And as I apply next layer, my previous layer surface of the paper is completely dry. Taking manganese violet, perylene violet and ultramarine blue mix and applying fine brush strokes to the right side. I can clearly see from the reference that that side is really dark violet color. And contrasty, it creates this darkness compared to the more brighter, lighter and juicy part of the plum. Take a look closely at the reference, pause the tutorial, and do you see these color tones? Do you see blues and violets in the shadow? And do you see yellows, pinks, and reds in the light area? Be careful with outer edges. Don't go over them and don't leave crisp edge lines. Here, edges should be soft and fluffy because we have this object which is round. It's not a leaf that is flat. It's not a flower petal that is flat. It's a plum, a fruit, which is three-dimensional and round. So we need to create this illusion that it has this roundness, it has this volume. Small and fine brush strokes, picking up watercolors in really small amounts. Layer is dry. Taking round synthetic brush, manganese violet, clean manganese violet, light amount, and going over with this round synthetic brush. This is for lightly smoothing the layer underneath and applying new watercolor layer using a mix of Indian yellow and permanent rose, this beautiful peachy color, and I can see quite a lot of this color tone on the left upper side. And I go carefully smoothing around light area, and with each new layer my light area is becoming smaller, which will give this gradual transition from the midtones gradually to the lighter tones, and ending with a little white spot of the paper, which is the shiny part that we see in the reference. Also with round synthetic brush, I'm applying shadow part of Perylene Violet Ultramarine Blue watercolors. Gradually, again, super transparently, nothing is too dark, nothing is too contrasty. I want to keep this lightness of this plum. Even with many layers, I will have the fluffy and fresh feeling of this plum, rather than if I will go saturated and super dark, I can end up with a heavy look, flat look of the painting. Again, checking layer underneath is completely dry. Moving over to the next layer, and I will be repeating these layers of finer brush strokes and round synthetic brush layers until I will get closer and closer to the saturation of the reference plum. Let's have another side view so you can see how I'm applying watercolor layers with the side of the brush to create this fluffy look of this plum. I have really small amount of water on my color palette, just enough to lift out watercolors from the color palette. It is almost dry and create this texture. It's mostly dry brush technique here. Continuing to apply watercolor layers, technique is the same, just repeating again and again, transparent layer after layer, till we get the result that we see in the reference. Gradually with patience. If you feel the urge to rush, pause, take a break, go away. Don't rush things here. If you want to get this plum roundish, three-dimensional and fluffy, This is the key to test your patience and be super cautious of what you are doing. Don't rush, don't paint too dark. Slowly, gradually, transparently, we are moving forward to get this plum realistic look and beautiful look that we see in the reference. Layer is dry, and using round synthetic brush, I'm applying transparent layer of Perlin Violet, Sennelier Red, Permanent Rose, and little touch of Indian Yellow. The mix that we pre-mixed in the beginning. I'm using watercolor mixes that I pre-mixed in the beginning. Nothing is changing at this point while we are painting plum fruit. If you run out of watercolor mixes, don't be afraid of that. Your painting can only benefit if you will have slightly different color tones. You know the pigments that you used in your mixes. They can change from my pigments, and that is normal. Experiment with watercolor pigments that you already have in your paint box. And as this plum is super rich with different color tones, it will only benefit if your next watercolor mix will slightly be different from the first one. Adding clean permanent rose to my color palette and continuing layering watercolors. As you can see, this plum slowly, I'm painting already 25 minutes, only just the plum fruit, and it's still quite light, but I'm slowly progressing and making it more looking realistic, roundish. I have my shadows now visible. Light area is becoming smaller compared to the beginning, but that is done super gradually. A little bit closer look, again permanent rose. I see that my painting is lacking of pink pigment, so that's why I'm transparent amount of permanent rose is applied to the upper left side of this plum, and also super small amount to the shadow area. Everything done is again lightly, gradually. Don't rush. Don't rush any stage in this painting process. It takes time. Realistic watercolor painting, and not just watercolor, any medium. If you want to get realistic, accurate look, it takes time. It takes really your effort, time, and patience to get the realistic result. If you are looking for fast results, then maybe more impressive painting would be your style that you could try, and always look for something, some new techniques, new approaches. Maybe you are more confident with more abstract painting. If you have the patience to sit for hours and maybe even split on many days your painting, then the realistic painting is your thing. But if you are all quite often frustrated of the amount of time you need to spend on some tiny painting, I would really suggest you try some other styles to paint. Realistic painting really takes time and effort. I always sometimes get tired to paint one little thing, then I skip to maybe other painting, or I take a break and do something completely different. Go into the garden, go for a walk, have a cup of tea. Then I come back with a fresh look and ready to spend some extra time on that little piece of painting. Now I'm applying clean Indian yellow, again with round synthetic brush. Layer underneath is dry, and as I'm painting with dry brush, I don't need to wait for the layer to get dry, because the amount of water on my brush and on my mixing palette is so super small amount. So as I finish painting one section, I can quickly go to the other section. It's dry and I can paint on and on without stopping. And we are slowly progressing, and this plum gets the color tone that we see in the reference, and slowly also saturation comes a little bit closer to the reference. It took time. It really takes time to achieve something roundish and realistic, but slowly we are progressing and getting better and better with this plum. Applying more shadow to the really lower part of this plum. It still needs more contrast, but better to go gradually to the shadow rather than don't know what to do with that darkness. So I'm always progressing in shadow area slowly. There's always room for making something darker. It's harder to make something lighter if we messed up with too dark watercolor mixes. Now loading my finer tip brush with the both darker watercolor mixes that we have, and I will start with those little spots that we see on the surface of the plum. Carefully looking at the reference, I don't need to completely make them as they look in the reference, but the reference is a nice guidance, and I can be as close as possible, but like I'm not aiming for 100% accuracy that exact spot is in the exact place on my painting as it is on the reference. I'm not so into hyper-realistic painting, but I like to use reference as a guidance, and I have the characteristic looks of the plum, but maybe something is slightly different, and that is also okay. This is your painting. You can leave those spots out. You don't need to paint them if you don't want to. If you are happy with the result at this point, that this plum looks realistic and fluffy and roundish, and maybe you are not so confident with spots, you can leave them out. Don't worry about them not adding that. Here's a side view of how I'm adding those spots with the very tip of the brush slightly touching the surface. I don't want to make them like big spots, but just this slight touch of different darker color tone. And again, the color tone is not super dark and contrasty, just slightly darker than the surface we already have. As I'm applying watercolors, I also left this little gap of lighter edge. I saw this lighter outer edge in the reference, and also as I'm applying watercolors right now, I'm applying them not straight to the very edge of the plum. I'm leaving little gap lighter. If you take a careful observation of the reference, you will notice that there's something lighter going on just right at the very edge of the plum. Take a look where it's darker, and here I have a lighter part. Building more contrast and adding more layers carefully around leaf that is overlapping plum. I'm adding more watercolors with a little brush strokes. It's even like stippling method. And I need the shadow underneath this leaf. The leaf has little spikes, so I'm again carefully with the very tip of the brush painting around those spikes. Moving forward slowly with accuracy, no need to rush here. More permanent rose layer, super transparent, super light layer with round synthetic brush. I can see that my painting is still lacking a little bit of pink color tone. And as I apply this super light permanent rose, I'm also making my light area again smaller, and it compared to the beginning part, now I'm very close to the reference, but it's not as wide as it was in the beginning. That happens with layering and to get this gradual look and finished look of the light area. Plum is finished, and now we can go to leaves. First, mixing watercolors using sap green, lemon yellow, separately because I see a lot of lemon yellow in those leaves, ultramarine blue, sap green, together with Indian yellow, another mix of sap green, Indian yellow, little touch of alizarin crimson. Be very careful when you are adding red pigment. It can quite fast go brown, but a little touch of red will give an earthy green watercolor mix. And on the side, perylene green. We will start with this little leaf that is overlapping plum. Using finer tip brush, watercolors that we pre-mixed, and going straight to the surface of this leaf. I'm going straight without watercolors. I'm not applying water layer before, just because this is so tiny and all these leaves have so many details that first I go straight with watercolors, and I'm doing really small brush strokes to get all the details, all the areas right as they are in the reference. Mostly I'm using for these leaves sap green, Indian yellow, little touch of alizarin crimson, and perylene green for darker parts. Again, reminding that be really careful with red pigment. It should be really small amount to get the earthy green look rather than have a brownish color. We will need brownish color for the stem part, and then I will add much more alizarin crimson, which will give me instantly this brown watercolor mix. One side of this leaf is much darker. We can see that in the reference. The other side is darker at the very top part, and then it gradually becomes lighter. And for the lighter part, I used ultramarine blue watercolors. I'm leaving little gap between green part and the outer edge where those little spikes are of the leaf edge. I see that there are lemon yellow, or you can use cadmium yellow, any yellow that you have in your paint box. I'm using lemon yellow for the parts that I clearly see in this reference that leaves have yellow color tone. taking lemon yellow watercolors and applying to the outer edge of the sleeve. Moving on to the next sleeve, and here I'm showing you a side view how I paint using the very tip of the finest brush. Again, I'm going straight with watercolors just because there's so many details. If I will apply a watery layer underneath that I can't control those little sections which are darker, which are lighter, I will have this smooth layer which will be required for the bigger leaves, but these small leaves are so tiny. There are these little veins, some darker, lighter sections, so I'm more in control when the layer underneath is completely dry. Using watercolor mixes that we pre-mixed, which is sap green, Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, and perlin green for the darker part. With these plum leaves, main thing to remember is go slowly. Again, yes, I will continue with that. Realistic painting requires slow process, but also careful observation of the reference. Everything here is manageable with the tip of the brush, but you need to be careful where you are applying those little brush strokes. Guidances are in the reference. Zoom in closer, the exact leaf, the exact area that you are painting. Don't look on an overall look of this reference. We will do that closer to the finishing part, but now we need to concentrate on each leaf that we are working on, and there's so many things going on in each leaf, but major things that we need to capture is the movement, how those leaves are curling, twisting around each other, and we need to get this characteristic look of these leaves and movement, transitions from lighter to darker. We need to leave light areas light. Again, we'll be leaving light area wider than it appears in the reference, so closer to the finishing I will have the size that I need. And I'm here not aiming for 100% accuracy because there's so many details, there's so many tiny veins. I don't need to capture all of them. I will have few veins visible, and that will give a viewer who is looking at my painting the feel that those leaves are small and there's so many veins. I'm getting this characteristic look. If I will be too obsessed with details, first of all, this is small work and those veins are micro small, and it's also impossible to get this look that we see in the reference. If that would be much bigger and large piece of art, then we could go more into detailing and showing more veins that are now. But with the smaller work, I need to get this look, this feeling that there are these veins, there are these little things going on with these, with the surface. Painting further, applying watercolors with the very tip of the brush and noticing where is shadow and darker areas on this tiny leaf, and applying watercolors gradually on those areas that I clearly see that are darker. On the areas that are much lighter, I applied ultramarine blue for cooler look. Ultramarine blue is creating this much cooler look of the surface. With a round synthetic brush, I can smooth some areas if they are maybe too crisp after finer brush strokes, and using small amount of watercolors, I'm going over painted sections. Another thing to learn and to try in your work is when you are applying shadow in one area, like right now I'm doing, I am also making veins slightly thinner. Key thing, one of the most important things for the realistically looking leaves are very fine and thin veins. To get that, we need to make them thinner and thinner with each new layer. That's what I'm doing when I'm applying shadow in one part. If it's right beside a vein, I'm making with each new brushstroke that vein thinner, using the very tip of the brush, and also veins when they are reaching outer edge or top of the leaf, they are almost disappearing. Veins at the beginning at the stem are thicker, and then they gradually become thinner and almost disappearing. loading my brush with lemon yellow pigment and applying yellow color tone to the vein, main vein and secondary veins. I see in the reference that veins are quite yellowish. They're not green, they're not gray, they are yellow. Alizarin crimson together with green mix that I have on my palette, it becomes brownish. Adding more alizarin crimson, adjusting. You can add also yellow, Indian yellow, and then again green watercolor mixes that you already have on your palette, and gradually achieve the brown watercolor that you need for painting stem. Starting with the stem little part that is connecting plum with the stem, and there are leaves overlapping that area, but still a teeny tiny part of that stem is visible. So be careful when you are painting that. Use the very tip of the brush, so don't go into the plum or into the leaves. Brush strokes that are applied for the stem are so tiny, like the stippling method, when you are placing little dots of brush strokes on the surface of the stem, creating uneven texture that is clearly visible in this reference, and applying more darker spots on the right side of the stem because it is in the shadow on the right side and it is in the light on the left side. Moving on to the next leaf, and the approach is the same. I'm constantly checking reference no matter how long I will paint. My guidances are in the reference. I'm using watercolors that we pre-mixed in the beginning, and the amount of watercolors that I use are so small. Brush strokes are small. I'm gradually painting and building. As these leaves are small, I'm not painting many layers. I'm going more into detailing and getting the look that I need, the characteristic look of these leaves. It's slightly different than it was with the plum, where we were adding so many layers to get this fluffy look. With leaves it's different, especially when we have so tiny details. I go straight with slightly darker watercolors than we use, for example, for a plum, just because there are these transitions and they are helping us create this realistic look of these leaves. lemon yellow together with sap green to the outer edge of the sleeve. Carefully looking at the reference. This sleeve has a nice cast shadow area from the upper leaf, which is much bigger. I will apply that as well. Outlining veins and creating shadow for that vein. Again, I will place just few veins to get that feeling, the look that there are these veins. And my brush strokes are super small and I'm painting with the very tip of the brush. Just slightly touching the surface of the paper. lemon yellow for the stem, and green mix for the starting part of the stem, where I see from the reference that that stem is in the shadow. Leaving upper two leaves for you to paint. They are the easiest one, and just few layers of the same technique that we were painting previous leaves, and I will move on to more advanced leaves to show you the process. Adding sap green, perlin green, Indian yellow to my color palette and a little touch of alizarin crimson, and painting further. Starting with a lemon yellow wash, I can clearly see that the upper part of the sleeve is so yellowish, so I'm starting with lemon yellow transparent wash. Ultramarine blue for the lighter parts. Applying green watercolor mix. And as you can see, when we have a watery layer underneath, we're not so in control of smaller details, but here I can see from the reference that this is shadow part, and I will not go into detailing a lot. Be careful when you are painting right beside the other finished sleeve. We don't want some extra brush strokes going over there. Smoothing the applied watercolors. As I apply brush strokes, I instantly wash my brush, dry it in paper towel, and smooth the applied layer. Carefully building layers, and I'm painting around those veins that I outlined with pencil, leaving them unpainted, and they are visibly yellow because the first layer was lemon yellow, and now I'm carefully painting around them, leaving those veins unpainted. And for now they look quite thick, but with each new layer I will try to make them thinner. Perlin green together with sap green and Indian yellow for the darker area. And as I'm applying shadow in one area, I'm making veins even smaller. Two more leaves are left, the bigger ones. Starting also the same way, applying lemon yellow wash on the whole leaf surface. This lemon layer is quite transparent. Everything is visible through. Careful with outer edges, those little spikes, paint them as well. Going over also vein areas, only leaving the lightest part that we see in the reference that are almost completely white because the light is shining on the leaf surface, and I'm leaving that area unpainted. Alizarin crimson for the stem part. Adding new amount of watercolor mix to my color palette. Again, don't be afraid to run out of your watercolor mixes. Better to mix smaller amount of watercolors, and then when you run out, you can mix again. If the color tone will slightly differ, not a problem. Your painting will only benefit from that. Sap green, perlin green, Indian yellow, and little touch of alizarin crimson. Taking ultramarine blue and little amount of sap green, applying to the lighter parts of this leaf. But this is really, really transparent. We don't want to have lighter parts completely blue. Just a little hint that area is pale blue. Carefully and accurately applying watercolors around veins. Technique is the same, approach is the same as the previous ones, only difference is that each leaf is slightly different, where the light is, where the shadow is, how it is curling, but careful observation of the reference is your guide where to paint, what to apply. There's not some kind of specific technique, rather than constantly looking at reference and trying to implement that into your work. Now the lighter part is unpainted, and now with the tip of the brush, with tiny brush strokes here and there, I'm applying green watercolor mix. Here is a side view, how it looks from different angle, and I'm using just the very tip of the brush to apply those layers, to apply those details. Applying shadow area behind each vein. For that I'm using sap green, perlin green, Indian yellow, and little touch of alizarin crimson. But again, doing it gradually. I don't want to have instantly darker spots. I'm building all transitions from lighter to darker gradually. As you can see, with tiny brush strokes, almost like stippling, because this is a so small area. These leaves are small. Even this outline, this painting is enlarged. In real life, they are even smaller. But if I would be painting as it is in real life, it would be hard to even to manage these few veins that I'm managing in this painting. With these tiny brush strokes, I don't want to cover the whole section of the light part. Creating these bits of color, green color, I noticed the same look in the reference. And I'm creating this visual look of that is the light area and there is something going on the surface. More contrast is required for the sleeve, and again when I'm applying shadow, I'm making veins thinner. Careful with those little spikes on the edge of the leaf. Now here is clearly visible how applying shadow I'm making main vein thinner. If you need, you can take an enlarging glass. That will be easier for you to see how to make something already small even smaller. Adding more layers, building contrast gradually on the right side, on the lower right side of this leaf. Shadows are slightly darker. Look carefully in your reference and in your painting. Don't skip part when you need to constantly look at the reference. In realistic painting, this is super crucial to follow guidances that you see in a reference. Our mind can't be so rich by imagining things. What we see in the reference in life, it's much richer with details. We can't even show all details with tiny brush strokes, but they are clearly there. And painting from mind is more for abstract painting, more for illustration, where you don't need so many details, different color tones, different tonal values, from shadows to halftones to lights. That is when you are painting from imagination, you are using lesser amount of details. But if you want a richer, more realistic look, then reference is your guide that you don't want to skip. Using round synthetic brush and small amount of lemon yellow, going over the whole section of painting area of the sleeve, smoothing slightly. And as I'm using super light amount, I'm not covering everything. As you can see, I'm going over the whole section, but everything is in places. Veins are in places, tonal values, shadows, lights. I'm slightly smoothing the surface, but still leaving details where they are. Building contrast on the cast shadow area. Now that the upper bigger leaf is painted, instantly the lower part of the leaf underneath becomes lighter. It's just a matter of contrast. When you have something completely white, then it's something else looks much darker, but as both leaves are painted, then the cast shadow area became visually lighter. Adding another layer, separating leaves one from each other with the shadow area, not with the darker lines. We're not outlining leaves to separate them one from each other, but I'm adding shadow. Last leaf. Approach is the same as we did previous leaves. Almost finishing this last leaf, and now we need to have an overall look on our painting and on the reference. Plum is there, leaves are there, but we need to compare one leaf with another, maybe plum with leaves, what is darker, what is lighter, where maybe we need to add more contrast. This is the point where you can paint on and on if you follow the guidances of painting transparently. This is the part where you can even make your veins thinner, you can add some details, maybe spots, maybe make your edges more neater and accurate, especially for leaves because they have those little spikes. Building contrast, separating with shadow one leaf from another. This is the moment where you can really paint on and on, push yourself a little bit further. My limit for this tutorial is time, and I'm showing you the approach, showing you guidances, but you can paint even longer after this tutorial finishes. Push yourself, paint for this composition, which is much complex with many details, extra 5 hours will be amazing. Okay, but I'm maybe exaggerating. Paint extra 30 minutes, maybe 1 hour. Push yourself a little bit further. Paint on your own. Try to look at the reference for guidances, because the more we look, the more we start to notice, and that is how our eyes are working. When we make a first just a little glimpse, then we see an overall details, but the more we look deeper, the more we observe, we start to notice little things, little changes. Now I'm adding contrast. I'm looking at overall look on the reference, and I see which leaf is maybe even darker and where I need to add something a little bit darker. But again, when you are applying shadow in one place in the leaf, don't apply it everywhere. To apply it with teeny tiny areas. Apply it a little bit there and a little bit on the other leaf. Just don't get too carried away with applying everything dark at this point. Don't lose light. Leave light area untouched. It's already good. But contrast in the shadow can be added. But again, gradually, carefully, slowly. Don't rush. You already done so much work, and this is the moment where you can make it better. But don't make it worse by rushing things. Adding final touches to leaves. Also, stem needs a little bit more contrast, and I want to thank you for painting this plum tutorial. I really enjoyed painting it, and the most important in all of this is to enjoy the process. Don't get stressed with the finished result. Don't get too excited of how it's gonna look. Enjoy it. Really be in the moment, be in the process. Don't rush, take it slowly and carefully, and everything will be amazing. Thank you for being here, thank you for joining, and see you in my next tutorials. Bye bye.